Jonathan Reed had it all: wealth, power, and a high-rise office in Chicago. But when his father falls ill, he's forced to return to the rundown family farm he once left behind. What starts as a business deal turns into a reckoning with his past, his values, and the true meaning of success. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun beat down on Jonathan Reed's designer suit as he stepped out of his sleek black Porsche. His Italian leather shoes crunched on the gravel driveway of his childhood home. At 40 years old, Jonathan was at the top of his game, CEO of Reed Enterprises, one of the most successful investment firms in Chicago, with offices in New York, London, and Tokyo. He frowned at the sight before him. The once white farmhouse now had peeling paint. The barn leaned slightly to one side, and the fence around the property needed serious repair. Everything about the place screamed neglect and poverty. "What a dump," he muttered, adjusting his gold cufflinks. His assistant, Melissa, emerged from the passenger side, her high heels sinking into the soft dirt. "Mr. Reed, should I wait in the car?" she asked, already looking uncomfortable in the rural setting. Jonathan nodded. "Yes, this won't take long. I'm going to convince my stubborn old man to sell this place once and for all." As Jonathan approached the porch, the screen door swung open. Thomas Reed, 75 years old with a weathered face and calloused hands, stood in the doorway. Despite his age, he stood tall, his blue eyes, the same color as Jonathan's, still sharp and clear. "Well, look who finally decided to visit," Thomas said, wiping his hands on his faded overalls. "Been what? 2 years?" Jonathan climbed the creaky steps. "Hello, Dad. We need to talk." Thomas stepped aside to let his son enter. Inside, the house was simple but clean. Old family photos lined the walls, most featuring Jonathan's late mother, Sarah, who had passed away 5 years ago. "Coffee?" Thomas offered, moving toward the kitchen. "No, I don't have time," Jonathan replied sharply. "Dad, I came here to talk business. This farm isn't making any money. You're living on Social Security and whatever small profits you can squeeze. Out of those few cows and chickens." Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee, unbothered by his son's tone. "I get by just fine." Jonathan ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "That's not the point. This land is valuable. That developer I told you about is still interested. They're offering $3 million, Dad. $3 million. You could live anywhere you want, a condo in Florida, a nice apartment in the city near me." Thomas took a sip of his coffee. "And why exactly would I want to be near you? So I can see you once a year instead of every 2 years. The words stung, but Jonathan pushed through. "That's not fair. I'm busy running a company." "Too busy for family," Thomas stated simply. "Just like you were too busy to come when your mother was sick." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Don't bring Mom into this. She understood my work." "She understood you, yes. Doesn't mean it didn't break her heart." Jonathan turned away, looking out the window at the fields where he had once played as a child. "Dad, this place is disgusting. Why are you still living in this filth? Sell this pigsty already. I can buy you a mansion, a luxury apartment, anything but this." Thomas set his cup down with a thud. For the first time, anger flashed in his eyes. "This pigsty put food on your table for 18 years. It paid for your fancy college education when scholarships didn't cover everything. Your mother and I worked our fingers to the bone so you could have opportunities we never had. And I'm grateful for that," Jonathan replied quickly. "That's why I want to give back. Let me help you." Thomas walked over to the mantel and picked up a framed photo. He handed it to Jonathan. "Do you remember this day?" Jonathan looked at the picture. A 5-year-old version of himself sat on a tractor, beaming with pride, his father standing beside him. "You were so excited to ride that tractor," Thomas continued. "Told everyone you were going to be a farmer like your daddy." Jonathan placed the photo back on the mantel. "I was a kid. Kids change their minds." "People change, yes. But I wonder if you changed for the right reasons." Jonathan checked his expensive watch. "Look, Dad, I have a meeting in Chicago at 4. Think about the offer. $3 million. You'd never have to worry about money again." Thomas laughed, a genuine belly laugh that caught Jonathan off guard. "Son, do you remember the first time you fell as a child?" Jonathan frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" His father smiled. You were 5, running through the fields full of energy. You tripped over a root and landed face first in the mud. You cried so hard, but I didn't pick you up. Jonathan rolled his eyes. Yeah, I remember. You told me to get up on my own. His father nodded. And you did. Because the only way to get stronger is to stand up by yourself. Jonathan crossed his arms. And? His father's smile faded. You think this farm is filth, but this pigsty raised you. This dirt fed you. This land put you through college. My hands, filthy as they may be, built the foundation that made you who you are today. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. You see money as power, his father continued, but real power is knowing where you came from and respecting it. Silence filled the room. For the first time, Jonathan didn't have a comeback. I'm not selling, Thomas said firmly. This is my home. It was your mother's home, and someday it'll be yours, whether you want it or not. Jonathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it and sighed. I have to go. Thomas walked him to the door. Next time, don't wait 2 years to visit your old man. As Jonathan reached his car, Melissa jumped out to open his door. How did it go, sir? He's not selling, Jonathan muttered, sliding into the leather seat. What's our next move then? She asked. Jonathan started the engine. I don't know, but I'm not giving up. As they drove away, Jonathan couldn't help looking in the rearview mirror at the farm growing smaller in the distance. His father stood on the porch, watching him leave. Back in Chicago that evening, Jonathan sat in his penthouse apartment, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. The city lights twinkled below like stars, but his mind was back on the farm. His phone rang. It was Jessica Morgan, his girlfriend of 8 months and a prominent fashion designer. Hey, how was your trip? She asked. Frustrating, Jonathan replied. My father refuses to sell that worthless farm. Is he okay living there alone? At his age, Jonathan paused. The question hadn't even occurred to him. He seems fine, stubborn as ever. Maybe he's afraid of change, Jessica suggested. Or maybe that place means more to him than money. It's not rational, Jonathan insisted. He's living in the past. After hanging up, Jonathan walked to his home office and opened his laptop. He pulled up the latest proposal from Midwest Development Corporation. Their plan would transform his father's farm into a luxury housing community, Reed Estates. As he stared at the digital mock-up, something felt wrong. The images showed perfectly manicured lawns where wildflowers once grew, swimming pools where he had chased fireflies, and tennis courts replacing the pond where his father had taught him to fish. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Reed, I've scheduled the meeting with the board for tomorrow morning to discuss the Hendricks acquisition. Thank you, Melissa, he replied automatically. Jonathan closed the laptop and walked to his bedroom window. Chicago's skyline was impressive, but tonight it felt cold and impersonal. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from his best friend and company CFO David Chen. Just heard from our source that Blackstone Holdings is preparing a hostile takeover of Mason Technologies. If we move fast, we can beat them to it. Business never stopped. There was always another deal, another acquisition, another million to be made. Yet tonight, the prospect didn't excite him as it usually did. Jonathan's thoughts drifted to his mother's funeral. Despite his father's stoic demeanor, Jonathan had caught him wiping away tears when he thought no one was looking. Thomas had stood alone at her grave long after everyone else had left. He had offered to buy his father a new house then too. Thomas had declined, saying, "Your mother is in every corner of that house. I'm not leaving her." The memory made Jonathan uncomfortable. He hadn't understood then, and he didn't understand now. As he prepared for bed, Jonathan's gaze fell on a small wooden box on his dresser, the only item in his minimalist apartment that didn't match the sleek modern decor. It was a simple box his father had carved for him on his 10th birthday. Inside was a collection of childhood treasures, a smooth stone from the creek, a blue ribbon from a county fair where he'd shown his first calf, and a faded photo of him with both his parents, all three smiling widely. Jonathan closed the box quickly, not wanting to confront the emotions it stirred. The next morning, Jonathan walked into the Reed Enterprises boardroom with his game face on. 12 executives sat around the table waiting for his direction. "Good morning, everyone," he began confidently. "Today we're discussing the Hendricks acquisition and our strategy for—" His phone rang, interrupting him. He checked the caller. ID, it was a number from his hometown. He was about to decline the call when something made him pause. "Excuse me a moment," he said to the room, stepping outside to answer. Jonathan Reed speaking. "Mr. Reed, this is Sheriff Parker from Millersville. I'm afraid I have some bad news about your father." Jonathan's heart dropped. "What happened?" "He collapsed in his barn this morning. A neighbor found him and called an ambulance. He's at County Hospital now. The world seemed to slow down around him." "How bad is it?" "The doctors are with him now. It might be his heart. They suggested you get here as soon as possible." Jonathan ended the call and stood frozen in the hallway. The boardroom door opened and David stepped out. "Everything okay?" he asked, concerned. "My father's in the hospital," Jonathan said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "I need to go," David nodded. "Go, I'll handle everything here." Within the hour, Jonathan was in his private jet, heading back to the small town he had been so eager to leave just yesterday. As the plane cut through the clouds, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, praying that his father would be all right. The sleek Porsche kicked up dust as Jonathan sped down the country roads toward County Hospital. His mind raced faster than the car. What if his father died? What if their argument yesterday was the last conversation they ever had? The thought made him push the accelerator harder. His expensive suit and corporate concerns suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the possibility of losing his only remaining parent. He had already lost one. He wasn't ready to lose another. Jonathan burst through the hospital doors, his designer, shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. The small county hospital was nothing like the private medical facilities he was used to in Chicago. The walls were an institutional beige, and the waiting room furniture looked at least 20 years old. "I'm looking for Thomas Reed," he said to the woman at the reception desk, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm his son." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up. "Oh, Mr. Reed, the doctors are with your father now. If you'll take a seat, I'll let them know you're here." Jonathan paced the waiting room, unable to sit still. The last time he'd been in this hospital was when his mother had her first cancer scare. She had recovered then, only to succumb to the disease years later at a much more expensive hospital in Chicago, where Jonathan had insisted on moving her for better care. A doctor in green scrubs approached. "Mr. Reed? I'm Dr. Martin. I've been treating your father." Jonathan shook his hand firmly. "How is he? What happened?" "Your father suffered a mild heart attack. We've stabilized him, but given his age and the fact that he lives alone, I'm concerned." "Can I see him?" Dr. Martin nodded. "Of course, he's awake now, room 212, down the hall to the right." Jonathan walked quickly to his father's room, pausing at the doorway. Thomas looked smaller somehow, lying in the hospital bed with an IV in, his arm and monitors beeping beside him. His weathered face was pale, but his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. "Dad?" Jonathan said softly, stepping into the room. Thomas turned his head slowly. A weak smile formed on his lips. Well, twice in 2 days. Must be some kind of record." Despite everything, Jonathan felt relief wash over him. His father's spirit was intact. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got kicked by a bull," Thomas replied. "But they tell me I'm too stubborn to die." Jonathan pulled a chair next to the bed and sat down. "You scared me. Did I now?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. Thought nothing could shake the mighty Jonathan Reed. "Dad, don't start. Not now." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. "The doctor says you had a heart attack." Thomas waved dismissively with his free hand. "A small one. I've had worse hangovers." "This isn't a joke. You're 75 years old, living alone on that farm, pushing yourself too hard." "It's my home," Thomas said firmly, his voice stronger now, "and I'm not leaving it." Before Jonathan could respond, a nurse entered the room. "Sorry to interrupt, but I need to check Mr. Reed's vitals." As the nurse worked, Jonathan stepped into the hallway and made a call to his assistant. "Melissa, cancel all my meetings for the rest of the week." My father is in the hospital, and I'll be staying in Millersville for a few days." When he returned to the room, the nurse was helping Thomas sit up. "Your father is doing well, all things considered," she told Jonathan, "but he'll need someone to stay with him when he's discharged tomorrow. He shouldn't be alone for at least a few weeks." After she left, Thomas looked at Jonathan. "Don't you even think about it. I'm not having some stranger nurse babysitting me." "Then I'll stay with you," Jonathan said decisively. Thomas laughed, then winced at the pain it caused. "You? In that house for more than a day? I'd like to see that." "I'm serious, Dad. I can work remotely for a while." Thomas studied his son's face. "What about your fancy girlfriend and that big company of yours? They can survive without their brilliant leader? Jessica will understand, and the company won't fall apart if I'm away for a short time." Jonathan paused, then added, "Unless you'd prefer I hire a nurse?" Thomas sighed. "Fine, but don't expect me to change my mind about the farm just because you're playing nursemaid." "That's not why I'm doing this," Jonathan said, though a small part of him wondered if that was entirely true. The next day, Dr. Martin discharged Thomas with strict instructions about medication, diet, and activity limitations. Jonathan helped his father into the Porsche, which looked ridiculously out of place in the hospital parking lot. "This thing is too low to the ground," Thomas complained, as he struggled to get comfortable. "Whatever happened to cars a man could actually get in and out of?" Jonathan bit back a retort and drove carefully back to the farm. As they pulled up to the house, he noticed things he hadn't seen yesterday. The garden his mother had loved still bloomed with late summer flowers. The old oak tree still held the remnants of his childhood swing, and the porch still had his parents' rocking chairs side by side. Inside the house, Jonathan helped his father settle into his recliner. "Are you hungry? I could make you something." Thomas looked skeptical. "You cook now?" "I can manage a sandwich," Jonathan replied dryly. While making lunch in the kitchen, Jonathan was surprised to find it well stocked and organized. His father might live simply, but he wasn't neglecting himself. The refrigerator held fresh vegetables, milk, and eggs from his own chickens. The bread was homemade, probably by Margaret Wilson, the neighbor who had found his father in the barn. Jonathan brought 2 plates to the living room and sat across from his father. "So what exactly happened yesterday? Margaret found you in the barn." Thomas took a bite of his sandwich before answering. "I was feeding the cattle, felt this pain in my chest like someone was sitting on me. Next thing I know, Margaret's standing over me yelling into her cell phone. You're lucky she stopped by. She brings me dinner every Sunday," Thomas said casually. "Has since your mother passed." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Margaret Wilson, the widow from down the road?" "Don't look at me like that," Thomas grumbled. "We're friends, that's all." Just then there was a knock at the door. Jonathan opened it to find a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked brown hair and warm brown eyes. "You must be Jonathan," she said, smiling. "I'm Margaret Wilson. I brought some chicken soup for your father." Jonathan stepped aside to let her in. "Thank you for finding him yesterday and for checking on him regularly." Margaret walked to Thomas's chair and set the soup container on the side table. "How are you feeling, Thomas?" "Better now," Thomas replied, and Jonathan was surprised to see his father's face soften. "Jonathan here thinks he's going to stay and take care of me for a while." Margaret looked at Jonathan with approval. "That's wonderful. Your father talks about you all the time. It'll be good for you two to spend some time together." After Margaret left, Jonathan raised an eyebrow at his father. "She seems nice." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Don't start." Later that afternoon, Jonathan set up his laptop at the kitchen table, determined to at least check his emails. He was surprised to find the internet connection better than expected. His father had upgraded to high-speed internet at some point. His inbox was flooded, but one email caught his attention immediately. It was from Midwest Development Corporation with an updated offer for his father's land. They had raised their bid to $3.5 million. Jonathan stared at the email, his finger hovering over the delete button. Instead, he closed his laptop without responding. That evening, as Thomas dozed in his recliner, Jonathan wandered through the house. Family photos lined the walls, many featuring himself at various ages. His high school graduation, his college graduation, even a newspaper clipping about his first major business success. His father had followed his career, even when Jonathan had barely made time for a phone call. In his old bedroom, everything remained surprisingly unchanged. Trophies from farm competitions, a few sports medals and books he had loved as a teenager still lined the shelves. His mother had preserved the room and his father had kept it that way. Jonathan opened the closet and found an old photo album he didn't recognize. Sitting on the bed, he flipped through pages of images. His parents when they were young, the early days of the farm and his own childhood moments. There were pictures of him helping his father with chores, riding his first horse and fishing in the pond. The last page contained a handwritten letter from his mother, dated just a week before she died. "My dearest Jonathan," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've finally come home to visit your father. I know your work keeps you busy, and I'm so proud of all you've accomplished. But remember that success isn't measured only in dollars and deals. Your father misses you terribly, though he's too proud to say it. This farm isn't just land and buildings. It's the story of our family, of our love, of your childhood. I hope someday you'll understand what it truly means. To us, all my love, Mom." Jonathan closed the album, his chest tight. His mother had known he wouldn't come back often. She had anticipated this distance between him and his father. His phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Jessica. "How's your father?" she asked when he answered. "Stable, stubborn." "The usual," Jonathan replied, trying to sound normal despite the emotion clogging his throat. "And how are you holding up on the farm? Found any cows to milk yet?" Her attempt at humor fell flat. "It's not that bad," he said, surprising himself with his defensiveness. "When are you coming back? The Goldstein Gala is this weekend, and everyone will be expecting to see you there." Jonathan looked around at his childhood bedroom. "I can't make it. My father needs me here." There was a pause on the line. "Jonathan, I understand family emergency and all, but can't you hire a nurse? This is the social event of the season." "Jessica, my father almost died yesterday. I think that takes precedence over a charity gala." "Of course it does," she backpedaled quickly. "I just meant, well, you've never been the nurturing type. This farm thing isn't really you." Her words struck a nerve. "Maybe you don't know me as well as you think." After hanging up, Jonathan returned to the living room to find his father awake and struggling to reach his medication on the coffee table. "Let me get that for you," Jonathan said, grabbing the pill bottle and a glass of water. Thomas took his medicine without argument, a sign that he wasn't feeling well. "You have a fight with your girlfriend? I could hear you all the way in here." Jonathan sat down across from him. "Jessica doesn't understand why I'm staying." "Can't say I blame her," Thomas replied. "It's not like you to choose family over business." The words stung because they were true. "People can change, Dad." Thomas studied his son's face. "What's really going on, Jonathan? Why this sudden interest in playing the devoted son? You had a heart attack. I'm worried about you. You've been worried about me for years, worried I wasn't selling this place, worried I was living in the past. That didn't bring you home before." Jonathan stood up, frustrated. "Why? Is it so hard for you to believe I might actually care?" "Because caring means showing up," Thomas said quietly. "Not just when there's a crisis." Before Jonathan could respond, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Sheriff Parker, still in uniform. "Evening, Thomas." "Jonathan," he said, nodding to both men. "Just wanted to check how you're doing." "I'm fine, Bill," Thomas replied. "No need for the whole town to fuss." Sheriff Parker smiled. "Well, when the town's most stubborn resident ends up in the hospital, people notice." He turned to Jonathan. "Good to see you back, though I'm sorry about the circumstances. Your dad's a fixture around here." After the sheriff left, Jonathan looked at his father curiously. "What did he mean by that?" Thomas shrugged. "Nothing important. Dad, I help out at the community center sometimes," Thomas said reluctantly. "Teach some of the kids about farming, that sort of thing." Jonathan was surprised. "You never mentioned that." "You never asked." The next morning, Jonathan woke early, a habit he'd never quite shaken from his farm days. The house was quiet, and for a moment he panicked, rushing to his father's room. Thomas was sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady. Relieved, Jonathan went to the kitchen to make coffee. Through the window he could see the barn and the fields beyond. The farm wasn't as neglected as he had first thought. The equipment was old but well maintained, and the small herd of cattle looked healthy. His phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from David. "Board is getting antsy about your absence. Blackstone made their move on Mason Technologies. We need your decision ASAP." In his previous life, the life he'd been living just 3 days ago, this would have sent him into immediate action, calling emergency meetings and working through the night. Now, looking out at the peaceful morning, the crisis seemed distant. He typed a quick reply. "Trust your judgment. Proceed as you see fit. We'll call later." As he set his phone down, he noticed his father standing in the doorway watching him. "You're up early," Thomas said, moving slowly to the kitchen table. "Old habits," Jonathan replied, pouring coffee for both of them. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm being smothered by an overprotective son," Thomas grumbled, but there was no real anger in his voice. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time." "I know," Jonathan said, placing a cup in front of his father. "But humor me." They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence, watching the sunrise through the kitchen window. Jonathan couldn't remember the last time he'd actually sat and watched a sunrise. "Your mother and I used to do this every morning," Thomas said suddenly. "Coffee at dawn. It was our time." Jonathan nodded, not knowing what to say. "After she died, I still did it, every day. Sometimes I talk to her, tell her about my day, what's happening on the farm." Thomas took a sip of his coffee. "She would have been happy to see you here." "I should have visited more," Jonathan admitted. "After Mom died, it was just hard to come back. For both of us," Thomas agreed. "This place isn't the same without her." It was the most honest conversation they'd had in years. Later that morning, as Jonathan was helping his father with his medication, a truck pulled up outside. A middle-aged man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt got out and approached the house. "That's Frank Miller," Thomas explained. "He helps me with the heavier farm work these days." Jonathan opened the door before Frank could knock. "Mr. Miller, I'm Jonathan, Thomas's son." Frank nodded. "Heard you were back. Also heard the old man gave everyone a scare." "I'm right here, Frank," Thomas called from his chair. "And I'm fine." Frank entered the house, looking around with obvious curiosity at Jonathan. "Your dad talks about you all the time. Says you're some big shot in the city." "I do all right," Jonathan replied, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "Frank, the cattle need feeding and I'm apparently not allowed to do anything," Thomas said pointedly. "Think you can handle it?" "No problem, boss," Frank said, turning to leave. "Good to meet you, Jonathan. About time you came home." After Frank left, Jonathan turned to his father. "You have help on the farm?" "Just part-time," Thomas explained. "Frank was having trouble making ends meet after the factory in town closed. I offered him work here. You never mentioned that either." Thomas shrugged. "Like I said, you never asked about my life." The realization hit Jonathan hard. He had assumed his father was struggling alone on a failing farm, but the reality was quite different. Thomas Reed had built a community around himself, neighbors who cared, people he helped, a life with purpose beyond just surviving. That afternoon, Jonathan's phone rang again. It was the CEO of Midwest Development Corporation. "Mr. Reed," the man said smoothly, "I understand you're back in town. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss our offer in person. I could come by tomorrow." Jonathan looked at his father, who was dozing in his chair, looking somehow both fragile and strong at the same time. "Actually," Jonathan replied, "now isn't a good time. My father isn't well and the farm isn't for sale. Please don't contact me about this again." He hung up, feeling a strange mix of emotions, part guilt for having pushed the sale himself, part relief for having finally shut it down. The sound of the front door opening startled him. Margaret Wilson entered with another container of food and a worried expression. "Jonathan," she said urgently, "you need to see this." She led him to the porch and pointed down the driveway. A sleek black car was parked on the county road and a man in an expensive suit was taking photographs of the property. "That's the third time this week I've seen someone from that development company snooping around," Margaret explained. "They've been pressuring everyone in the area to sell." Jonathan felt a surge of protectiveness. Wait here with my father." He walked down the driveway, anger building with each step. The man saw him approaching and quickly got back in his car, but Jonathan reached him before he could drive away. "This is private property," Jonathan said, his voice cold and authoritative, the same tone he used in hostile takeovers. "And it's not for sale. Tell your boss that if I see anyone from Midwest Development on this land again, I'll have them arrested for trespassing." The man drove away quickly, and Jonathan returned to the house, his mind racing. What was really going on with this development deal? Why were they so persistent about this particular piece of land? Back inside, Margaret was sitting with Thomas, who was now awake and looking concerned. "What's going on?" Thomas asked. Jonathan sat down across from him. "Dad, how long has Midwest Development been after your land?" "About a year," Thomas replied. "Started right after old Jenkins sold his place." Margaret nodded. "They've bought up almost 500 acres around here already. And they're particularly interested in your land," Jonathan pressed. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look. "They want the water rights," Thomas finally said. "This property controls access to the county's largest underground aquifer." Jonathan's business instincts kicked in. "They're not building luxury homes, they're after the water." "Smart boy," Thomas said with a hint of pride. "Took you long enough to figure it out. Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas fixed him with a steady gaze. "Would you have believed me, or would you have thought I was just being a stubborn old man?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jonathan had no answer, because until 3 days ago he would have dismissed his father's concerns without a second thought. As the sun set over the farm, Jonathan stood on the porch, watching the changing colors of the sky. His phone buzzed with another call from Jessica, but he let it go to voicemail. For the first time in years, the constant demands of his city life seemed less important than the quiet lessons he was learning on this small piece of land. Lessons about what really mattered, about the true meaning of wealth, and about the father he had never really known. And somewhere deep inside, a part of him that had been dormant for decades began to wake up, the part that remembered what it felt like to be connected to this place, to this land, and to the man who had raised him to stand on his own. A week had passed since Thomas came home from the hospital. The morning routine that Jonathan had established surprised even himself. Wake at dawn, check on his father, make breakfast, help with medication, and then set up his laptop at the kitchen table to handle the most urgent work matters. This particular morning, Jonathan was frying eggs when his father shuffled into the kitchen, moving a little easier than he had days before. "Smells good," Thomas said, easing himself into a chair. "Your mother would be shocked. She could barely get you to pour your own cereal as a teenager." Jonathan smiled as he slid the eggs onto a plate. "People change, Dad." "So you keep saying." Thomas took a bite and nodded approvingly. "Not bad for a city boy." Jonathan's phone. It rang David again. He'd been calling daily with updates and increasingly urgent questions. Jonathan excused himself and stepped onto the porch to take the call. "Please tell me you're coming back soon," David said without preamble. "The Mason Technologies deal is falling apart, and the board is getting restless." "My father still needs me here," Jonathan replied, watching a pair of cardinals at the bird feeder his father had hung years ago. "Can't you handle it?" David's frustration was clear even through the phone. "I've been handling it, but I'm not the CEO. The board wants you, Jonathan. And honestly, so do our clients. People are starting to talk." "About what?" "About whether Jonathan Reed has lost his edge, whether he's abandoned the company for some farm nostalgia trip." The words stung. "That's ridiculous. I'm working remotely. It's not the same and you know it. Look, I understand family obligations, but it's been a week. Hire a nurse. Come back for at least a few days. Show your face at the office." Jonathan sighed. "I'll think about it." When he returned to the kitchen, Thomas was looking at him with knowing eyes. "Trouble at the Empire?" "Nothing I can't handle," Jonathan replied, sitting down with his own breakfast. "You don't have to stay, you know," Thomas said casually. "I'm feeling better. Margaret checks on me. Frank helps with the farm." "I'm not leaving you alone, Dad." "Not yet." Thomas studied his son. "This isn't like you, Jonathan. What's really going on?" Before Jonathan could answer, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Sheriff Parker standing there, his expression serious. "Morning, Jonathan. Is your father up? I need to speak with both of you." Jonathan led him to the kitchen, where Thomas was already looking concerned. "What brings you by so early, Bill?" Thomas asked. Sheriff Parker removed his hat. "I've got some troubling news. There was a small fire at the Jenkins property last night." "Fire?" Thomas repeated. "Was anyone hurt?" "No. The place has been empty since the development company bought it. But here's the thing, it was definitely arson. And this morning I found these posted all over town." He placed a flyer on the table. The paper showed a crude drawing of a bulldozer with a red X through it. Below were the words, "Stop Midwest Development, protect our water, protect our homes." "Some folks around here are getting riled up about the development plans," Sheriff Parker explained. "There's talk that Midwest wants to bottle our water and sell it, leaving the county high and dry." Thomas shook his head. "That's exactly what they're planning, Bill. I told the county council months ago." "Well, now people are taking matters into their own hands, and that's not good for anyone." The sheriff looked at Jonathan. "I heard you had a confrontation with one of their representatives last week," Jonathan straightened. "He was trespassing on private property. I merely informed him that the land isn't for sale." "I understand, but given your corporate background, I wanted to make sure you know the situation here is getting tense. The last thing we need is outside agitation." After the sheriff left, Thomas sighed heavily. This was bound to happen. People around here don't take kindly to outsiders trying to steal their water. "But arson isn't the answer," Jonathan replied. "There must be a legal way to stop them." Thomas laughed without humor. "Legal? Against a big corporation with deep pockets? The county can't afford that kind of fight." Jonathan's mind was already working, his business instincts kicking in. "Maybe they can't, but I can." Later that morning, Jonathan drove into town to pick up his father's prescription. Millersville's main street hadn't changed much since his childhood. The same brick buildings, the same small shops, though several storefronts now stood empty. As he walked out of the pharmacy, a sleek black car pulled up beside him. A man in an expensive suit emerged, smiling broadly. "Mr. Reed, I thought that was you." "Michael Prescott, CEO of Midwest Development." Jonathan recognized the name from the emails. "Mr. Prescott, I believe I made my position clear to your employee. My father's farm is not for sale." Prescott's smile didn't waver. "Perhaps we could discuss this over lunch. I'm sure once you understand the full scope of our plans, you'll see the benefits." "I understand your plans perfectly well," Jonathan replied coldly. "You want to bottle our aquifer water and sell it, leaving the county without its most valuable natural resource." Prescott's smile finally faltered. "That's a very simplistic view. Our project would bring jobs, tax revenue, save it." Jonathan cut him off. "I've heard these pitches before. Hell, I've made these pitches before. The answer is still no." As Jonathan turned to leave, Prescott called after him. "You know, it's interesting to see Jonathan Reed, corporate raider, suddenly playing the small-town hero. What would your board say if they knew you were actively working against the interests of your shareholders?" Jonathan stopped and turned slowly. "Is that a threat, Mr. Prescott?" "Not at all, just an observation." Prescott handed him a business card. "When you're ready to talk seriously, call me. Everyone has a price, Mr. Reed, even your father." Jonathan watched Prescott drive away, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. The man wasn't wrong. Jonathan had built his career on finding people's prices, on closing deals that seemed impossible. He had been on the other side of this equation many times. Walking back to his car, Jonathan noticed more of the anti-development. Flyers posted on lampposts. The town was dividing, and his father was caught in the middle. When he returned to the farm, he found Margaret sitting with his father on the porch, both looking worried. "What's wrong?" Jonathan asked. "Frank just called," Thomas explained. "Someone vandalized the development company's office in town. Broke windows, spray-painted messages on the walls. This is getting out of hand," Margaret added. "People are scared, angry." Jonathan sat down heavily. "I ran into Michael Prescott in town. He's not backing down." Thomas nodded grimly. "Men like that never do, not unless they're forced to." That evening, as Thomas rested, Jonathan made a series of phone calls. First to his assistant, requesting detailed research on Midwest Development, their financial structure, previous projects, any lawsuits or controversies. Then to David, explaining that he needed another week away from the office. "Another week?" David exploded. "Jonathan, the board is meeting tomorrow. They're discussing your future with the company. I can't cover for you anymore." "Then don't," Jonathan replied calmly. "Tell them I'm dealing with a personal matter. Tell them I'll address their concerns when I return." "And when will that be?" "When my father is better, and this situation with Midwest Development is resolved." There was a long silence on the line. "You've changed," David finally said. "I don't even recognize you anymore." After hanging up, Jonathan made one more call to Jessica. She had been sending increasingly irritated texts about his absence. "Finally," she answered. "Are you coming home soon? The Morris wedding is this weekend, and I already RSVP'd for both of us." "I can't make it," Jonathan said. "I'm still needed here." Jessica's voice hardened. "Jonathan, it's been over a week. Hire someone to look after your father. You have a life here, responsibilities." "My father is my responsibility too." "Since when?" she challenged. "You barely mentioned him before this heart attack. Now suddenly you're the devoted son. This isn't you." Jonathan was silent for a moment. "Maybe I'm figuring out who I really am." "Well, while you're having this midlife crisis or whatever it is, your actual life is falling apart. David called me, you know. He says the board is questioning your commitment. Let them question it." Jessica's tone changed, becoming gentler, more persuasive. "Jonathan, I'm worried about you, this farm thing. It's not who you are. You're Jonathan Reed, CEO of Reed Enterprises. You belong in Chicago, not some backwater town. Playing farmer." Her words echoed what he'd been telling himself for years, what had driven him to leave this place behind. But now they rang hollow. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, instead of arguing. "I need to check on my father." The next morning, Jonathan woke to find Thomas already up and dressed, looking determined. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Going to town," Thomas replied firmly. "There's a county council meeting about the development project. I need to be there. The doctor said you should be resting." Thomas gave him a look that brooked no argument. "I've been resting for over a week. This is important, Jonathan. If you're worried, you can drive me." The meeting was being held in the high school gymnasium, the only space large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered. Jonathan helped his father to a seat near the front, noticing the tension in the room. Farmers sat on one side, many wearing anti-development buttons. On the other side were business owners and a few people in suits, clearly Midwest Development supporters. Michael Prescott sat at a table with the county council members, looking confident and polished. When he spotted Jonathan and Thomas, a brief look of surprise crossed his face. The council chairwoman, an older woman with steel-gray hair, called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the proposed Midwest Development project and its potential impact on our community." Prescott stood first, presenting slick graphics and promising economic benefits, new jobs, increased tax revenue, improved infrastructure. He never directly mentioned the water bottling plant, instead focusing on the housing development and commercial spaces. After his presentation, community members began to speak. A local business owner talked about the need for economic growth. A teacher expressed concern about water rights. Frank Miller described how his family had farmed the same land for generations, relying on the aquifer. Finally, Thomas Reed stood up. Jonathan moved to help him, but his father waved him off, making his way slowly to the microphone. "Many of you have known me all your lives," Thomas began, his voice steady despite his recent illness. "The Reed family has farmed in this county for 4 generations. My wife Sarah and I raised our son here." He nodded toward Jonathan. "This land isn't just dirt and crops to us. It's our heritage, our legacy." The room was silent, respectful. Mr. Prescott and his company see dollar signs when they look at our water. They'll drain our aquifer, bottle it, and sell it back to us at a premium. And when the water's gone, they'll be gone too, leaving us with nothing but empty promises and dry wells. Prescott stood up. "That's simply not true. Our environmental impact studies were conducted by a firm you paid," Thomas interrupted. "My family has been monitoring the aquifer levels for decades. We know what we're talking about." The debate grew heated, with council members asking pointed questions and community members voicing strong opinions on both sides. Throughout it all, Jonathan watched his father, standing tall despite his illness, fighting for what he believed in. When the meeting ended without a resolution, the council promising to review all information before making a decision, Thomas looked exhausted. Jonathan helped him to the car, worried about the strain on his heart. "You should have let me speak," Jonathan said as they drove home. "I know how to handle men like Prescott." Thomas looked at his son. "This isn't a boardroom battle, Jonathan. This is about people's lives, their homes." "I understand that now, Dad." That night, as Thomas slept, Jonathan sat on the porch with his laptop, reviewing the research his assistant had sent. Midwest Development had a history of similar projects, buying up land in rural communities, extracting resources, and leaving environmental damage behind. They had faced lawsuits in 3 states but had always managed to settle quietly. His phone lit up with a text from David. "Board voted to give you 2 more weeks. After that, they want you back, or they'll consider other options." I did what I could. Jonathan stared at the message, feeling strangely detached. 2 weeks ago, the threat of losing his position would have sent him racing back to Chicago. Now, looking out at the starlit sky over his father's farm, he wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the driveway. It was nearly midnight, too late for visitors. Jonathan stood up, suddenly alert. A familiar red sports car parked beside his Porsche. Jessica stepped out, looking completely out of place in her designer dress and high heels. "Jessica, what are you doing here?" She approached the porch, wobbling slightly on the gravel. "Surprise! If you won't come to me, I'll come to you." Jonathan helped her up the steps, noticing she'd been drinking. "You should have called first." "Why, so you could make up another excuse?" She looked around the porch with thinly veiled disdain. "So this is the famous farm. It's rustic." "My father is sleeping," Jonathan said quietly. "He needs his rest." Jessica waved dismissively. "Don't worry, I'm not staying. I just came to talk some sense into you." She reached for his hand. "Jonathan, this has gone on long enough. The board is losing confidence. Your clients are getting nervous. You need to come home." "I told you, your father has managed without you for years," she interrupted. "He has neighbors, friends. He doesn't need you here playing nurse." Jonathan pulled his hand away. "It's not about need. It's about finally being here for him." Jessica studied his face. "You've changed, and not for the better. The Jonathan I know wouldn't throw away everything he's worked for over some sentimental farm attachment. Maybe you never really knew me. Or maybe you're having a breakdown," she countered. "Midlife crisis, daddy issues. Whatever this is, you need to snap out of it. Your real life is in Chicago." Before Jonathan could respond, the screen door opened. Thomas stood there in his robe, looking between them with interest. "You must be Jessica," he said. "I'd say Jonathan has told me all about you, but that would be a lie." Jessica quickly composed herself, putting on a charming smile. "Mr. Reed, I've heard so much about you. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "Circumstances of your choosing," Thomas replied mildly. "It's a bit late for social calls." Jessica's smile faltered. "I was just concerned about Jonathan. He's been away from work for so long." "Concerned about Jonathan, or concerned about what his absence means for your social calendar?" Thomas asked bluntly. "Dad," Jonathan warned. Jessica's face hardened. "I can see where Jonathan gets his stubborn streak. But this little father-son reunion is costing him his career. Is that what you want?" Thomas stepped fully onto the porch. "What I want is for my son to make his own choices, not be bullied into them." Jessica turned to Jonathan, her patience clearly at an end. "I'm going back to the hotel in town. You have until tomorrow to decide what's more important, the life we've built together or this." She gestured dismissively at the farm. After she drove away, Thomas and Jonathan sat in silence for a moment. "Charming girl," Thomas finally said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jonathan couldn't help but laugh. "She's not usually like that." "No? Seems exactly like the type of woman I'd expect you to choose. Ambitious, focused on appearances, more interested in your title than who you are. That's not fair, Dad, Thomas shrugged. Maybe not. But ask yourself, does she love Jonathan Reed the man or Jonathan Reed the CEO? The question lingered in Jonathan's mind as he tried to sleep that night. He had built his entire adult life around his career, his success. He had chosen a partner who fit into that world perfectly. But now, lying in his childhood bed, he wondered if that world had ever truly fit him. The next morning, Jonathan drove into town to meet Jessica at her hotel. She was waiting in the lobby, perfectly put together as always, scrolling through her phone. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jonathan began as they sat down for coffee. Jessica looked hopeful. "So you're coming home?" "Not yet." Jonathan saw her face fall. "Jessica, something important is happening here. My father needs me, yes, but it's more than that. This community is fighting for its survival against a company that wants to exploit them. And that's your problem because I know how companies like Midwest Development operate. I've been them. I can help stop them." Jessica set down her coffee cup with a sigh. "Jonathan, listen to yourself. You're a corporate CEO, not an environmental activist. This isn't your fight. It is now." She studied his face. "You've always been stubborn, but this is different. It's like you've forgotten who you are." "Or maybe I'm remembering who I was meant to be," Jonathan replied quietly. Jessica's expression hardened. "I can't wait around while you have this farm epiphany. I have a life in Chicago, a life we built together. I know. And I'm asking you to be patient." She stood up, gathering her purse. "Call me when you're ready to be Jonathan Reed again. The real Jonathan Reed." As she walked away, Jonathan felt a mixture of sadness and relief. He cared for Jessica, but her vision of who he was had never allowed room for growth or change. And he was changing. There was no denying that now. Back at the farm, Jonathan found Margaret sitting with his father on the porch. "Everything okay?" Thomas asked as Jonathan joined them. "Jessica's gone back to Chicago," he replied simply. Margaret gave him a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, Jonathan." "Don't be. It was my choice." Thomas raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, he handed Jonathan the local newspaper. The headline read, "Council delays vote on Midwest Development Project, requests more information." "They're stalling," Thomas explained. "But Prescott won't give up easily." Margaret nodded in agreement. "The whole town's talking about the meeting yesterday. Your father's speech made an impression." "It wasn't enough," Thomas said grimly. "We need hard evidence that their project will damage the aquifer." Jonathan looked at his father thoughtfully. "You said your family has been monitoring the aquifer for decades. Your grandfather started keeping records back in the 1950s, after the drought nearly wiped out half the farms in the county." "I'd like to see those records." Thomas led Jonathan to his office, a small room off the living room that Jonathan had barely noticed before. Inside were filing cabinets, bookshelves, and a desk covered with papers. Thomas opened a cabinet and pulled out several worn notebooks. Every measurement, every test, recorded by hand. "Your mother digitized some of the later years, but most of it is still on paper." Jonathan flipped through the notebooks, impressed by the meticulous records. "This is exactly what we need. If we can prove the aquifer can't sustain large-scale commercial extraction without harming local farms, then the council will have to reject Midwest's proposal," Thomas finished. For the first time since arriving at the farm, Jonathan felt truly energized. This was a challenge he understood: data, analysis, strategy. But unlike his corporate battles, this one had real meaning, real consequences for people he was beginning to care about. As he began the painstaking work of organizing and digitizing the aquifer records, Jonathan realized something surprising. He didn't miss the boardroom. He didn't miss the endless meetings, the power lunches, the constant pressure to grow, acquire, expand. What he had found here, in this simple farmhouse with his recovering father, was something he hadn't experienced. In years, purpose. Not just profit, but genuine purpose. That night, as he worked late into the evening, his phone rang. It was David again. "Jonathan, we need to talk. Midwest Development has approached Reed Enterprises about a potential partnership." Jonathan sat up straight. What kind of partnership? They want our financial backing for a project in rural Illinois. They specifically asked for you to personally oversee the investment. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. It's a bribe, David. They're trying to buy me off. What are you talking about? The project is here, in my father's county. They want our water. David was silent for a moment. Jonathan, this could be a lucrative opportunity for the company. The board would expect you to at least consider it. Tell them I'm not interested, and tell them Reed Enterprises doesn't do business with companies that exploit small communities. After hanging up, Jonathan sat back in his chair, thinking. Midwest was getting desperate if they were trying to pull him in through his own company. But this move also gave him an idea, a way to fight back using the very skills and connections he had built in the corporate world. The next morning, Jonathan made a series of calls to former clients, partners, and a few carefully chosen journalists. By noon, he had arranged a video conference with environmental reporters from 3 major newspapers. What are you up to? Thomas asked, watching his son set up his laptop on the kitchen table. Fighting fire with fire, Jonathan replied with a grim smile. Midwest wants to use corporate pressure. So can we. As Thomas watched, Jonathan conducted the video call, providing the journalists with detailed information about Midwest's history of environmental damage, their previous lawsuits, and their current plans for the aquifer. He was articulate, authoritative, and passionate, using his corporate persona for a completely different purpose. One more thing, Jonathan said as the call was ending. I want to go on record that Reed Enterprises will not be partnering with Midwest Development on this or any other project. After the call ended, Thomas looked at his son with newfound respect. You just put your own company in the middle of this fight. It was already in the middle. Prescott made sure of that. Jonathan closed his laptop. Dad, I think it's time I told you something. I'm not sure I want to go back to my old life. Thomas studied his son's face. Because of the farm. Not just the farm. Being here, seeing what really matters. It's changing me. Or maybe it's bringing me back to who I was before I got so caught up in making money and closing deals. Thomas smiled slightly. Your mother always said you'd come back someday. I didn't believe her. Shows what I know. I'm not saying I want to be a farmer, Jonathan clarified, but I want my work to mean something, to help people, not just make them richer. Before Thomas could respond, Frank Miller's truck came speeding. Up the driveway, he jumped out looking agitated. Thomas, Jonathan, you need to see this. They followed Frank to his truck where he turned up the radio. A local news reporter was speaking. Breaking news from County Hall. The council has just announced an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning to vote on the Midwest Development proposal. Sources say the company has offered to increase their financial contribution to the county in exchange for expedited approval. Thomas slammed his hand on the truck's hood. They're trying to push it through before we can organize our evidence. Jonathan's mind was already racing, forming a plan. Not if we can help it. Frank, I need you to gather as many people as you can. Everyone who spoke against the project at the last meeting. Margaret, can you call the newspaper? We need this to be front page news. As Frank and Margaret left on their missions, Thomas looked at his son with a mixture of pride and worry. What are you planning? Jonathan smiled grimly. Something I'm good at, Dad. A hostile takeover of their narrative. The battle lines were drawn. Tomorrow would determine not just the fate of the aquifer and the community, but also Jonathan's future. For the first time in his life, he was using his corporate power to protect rather than acquire, and it felt right in a way his previous successes never had. As night fell over the farm, father and son sat on the porch, preparing for the fight. Ahead, the stars shone brightly overhead, the same stars that had guided the Reed family for generations. Jonathan looked at his father, seeing not the stubborn old man he had dismissed for so long, but a man of principle, of strength, of wisdom. Thank you, Jonathan said suddenly. For what? Thomas asked. For not selling, for fighting, for teaching me what really matters. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's the thing about lessons, son. Sometimes they take a lifetime to learn. In the distance, the lights of Millersville twinkled, a community unaware that its future hung in the balance. Tomorrow would bring the climax of their struggle against Midwest Development, and for Jonathan Reed, It would bring a reckoning with the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. The morning of the emergency council meeting dawned clear and cool. Jonathan had been awake since 4 a.m., reviewing the aquifer data and preparing his presentation. Thomas found him in the kitchen, surrounded by papers and his laptop, a half-empty pot of coffee beside him. "Did you sleep at all?" Thomas asked, pouring himself a cup. Jonathan shook his head. "Couldn't. Too much riding on today." Thomas sat across from him, studying the dark circles under his son's eyes. "You know, you remind me of myself at your age. When something matters, you give it everything." "I never thought we were alike," Jonathan admitted. "I always saw us as complete opposites. That's because you were looking at the surface. City versus country, business versus farming. But underneath?" Thomas tapped his chest. "Same heart, same values. You just buried them." For a while. The phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Margaret, her voice excited. "You won't believe what just happened. Turn on the local news." Jonathan switched on the small TV in the living room. The morning news anchor was speaking earnestly. "In a stunning development, 3 major national newspapers have published investigations into Midwest Development Corporation, raising serious concerns about their environmental practices. The reports allege that Midwest has a history of depleting natural resources in rural communities and leaving environmental damage behind. The company's stock has already dropped 8% in pre-market trading." Jonathan smiled grimly. "Looks like my journalist friends came through." "You did this?" Thomas asked, impressed. "I made some calls, told them where to look." Jonathan turned off the TV. "But it won't be enough to stop the vote. We still need to show up in force." By 9 o'clock, the high school gymnasium was packed. Jonathan helped his father to a seat in the front row, noticing how many people greeted Thomas with respect and affection. Frank had done his job well. Nearly everyone who had opposed the development at the previous meeting was present, along with many new faces. Michael Prescott sat at the council table, looking considerably less confident than before. When he spotted Jonathan, his eyes narrowed with recognition and anger. The council chairwoman called the meeting to order. "Due to the urgent nature of this session, we'll be limiting public comments to 2 minutes per person. Midwest Development. We'll present first, followed by community responses." Prescott stood, straightening his tie. "Ladies and gentlemen, I won't pretend I haven't seen today's news. These reports contain numerous inaccuracies and outright falsehoods, which our legal team is already addressing." He forced a smile. "But I'm not here to discuss the past. I'm here to talk about the future of Millersville. Our revised proposal includes an additional $2 million for community development and 50 new permanent jobs. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for economic growth." As Prescott continued his pitch, Jonathan noticed something interesting. The council members weren't making eye contact with him. They were shuffling papers, looking uncomfortable. When it was time for community responses, several farmers spoke about their dependence on the aquifer. Margaret discussed the environmental impact. Frank talked about generations of families who would be affected. Finally, it was Jonathan's turn. He walked to the microphone, carrying his father's notebooks and printouts of his analysis. "My name is Jonathan Reed. Many of you knew me as a boy before I left for Chicago to build my business." He paused, looking around the room. "I've spent the last 15 years in boardrooms with men like Michael Prescott, making deals not unlike the one he's proposing today." The room was silent, everyone listening intently. "So I know exactly how this works. Midwest Development isn't interested in Millersville's growth. They're interested in your water. They'll drain your aquifer, bottle it, sell it, and when it's gone, they'll be gone too, leaving you with dry wells and empty promises." Prescott stood up. "This is slander." "He has no proof of—" "Actually, I do have proof," Jonathan interrupted, holding up the notebooks. "My family has been monitoring the aquifer levels for 3 generations. I've analyzed this data alongside Midwest's own environmental impact study. Their projected extraction rate would deplete the aquifer by 40% within 5 years." Jonathan distributed copies of his analysis to the council members. "Furthermore, I've brought copies of court settlements from 3 other communities where Midwest operated. Each one shows a pattern of resource depletion and environmental damage. The council members flipped through the documents, looking increasingly concerned. Prescott was now on his feet, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. Mr. Reed has a personal vendetta because we wanted to buy his father's worthless farm. He's bitter and using his corporate connections to spread lies." The council chairwoman raised her hand. "Mr. Prescott, please take your seat. Mr. Reed has the floor," Jonathan continued calmly. "What Mr. Prescott isn't telling you is that he approached my company, Reed Enterprises, offering us a partnership in this venture, obviously hoping to buy my silence and cooperation. He looked directly at Prescott. I declined, and I have publicly announced that my company will never do business with corporations that exploit small communities." A murmur ran through the crowd. Prescott sputtered, trying to regain control of the narrative, but the damage was done. Jonathan finished his presentation by pointing to his father. "I left this town thinking success meant tall buildings, expensive suits, and million-dollar deals. It took my father's illness to bring me back and show me what real success looks like. It looks like a community that stands together. It looks like people who protect what matters for future generations. It looks like this room right now." The applause was immediate and thunderous. People stood, cheering. Thomas remained seated, but the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. After several more speakers, the council chairwoman called for a vote. One by one, the council members voted, 4 against the development project, 1 abstaining. The proposal was rejected. The gymnasium erupted in celebration. People surrounded Thomas and Jonathan, shaking their hands, patting their backs. Frank lifted his hat in salute. Margaret hugged them both, tears in her eyes. Michael Prescott stormed out without a word, his dream of exploiting Millersville's water crushed. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas turned to his son. "Not bad for a city boy." Jonathan laughed. "I had a good teacher." Later that afternoon, back at the farm, Thomas and Jonathan sat on the porch, enjoying the peaceful aftermath of their victory. The phone had been ringing constantly, journalists seeking comments, community members expressing gratitude, and finally David from Reed Enterprises. "The board is in an uproar," David reported. "Your public statements about Midwest development have created quite a stir. Some are calling it a brilliant PR move, positioning Reed Enterprises as socially responsible. Others are questioning your judgment." "And what do you think?" Jonathan asked. David sighed. "I think you've changed, and I'm not sure if that's good or bad for the company." He paused. "The 2 weeks are almost up, Jonathan. The board needs an answer. Are you coming back?" "I need a little more time," Jonathan replied, looking out at the fields where cattle grazed peacefully. After hanging up, Thomas studied his son. "You're really considering staying, aren't you?" "Not just staying," Jonathan said slowly. "I've been thinking about something different, a new direction for Reed Enterprises." "What kind of direction?" Jonathan turned to face his father. "What if instead of helping corporations take over small businesses, we helped small communities protect themselves? What if we used our resources and expertise to fight against the Michael Prescotts of the world?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you're talking about changing your entire business model." "I am." Jonathan stood up, energized by the idea. "Dad, what we did today, using corporate tactics to help people instead of exploit them, it felt right, more right than any deal I've ever closed. Your board might not agree. Then I'll buy them out. Start something new if I have to." Jonathan paced the porch, his mind racing. "I could set up a foundation to help rural communities facing corporate takeovers, provide legal support, media connections, strategic advice." Thomas watched his son with growing interest. "You're serious about this?" "I am." Jonathan stopped pacing. "But I'd need someone who understands rural communities, someone who can spot the real issues, who has connections with farmers and small-town officials." A slow smile spread across Thomas's face. "Are you offering me a job, son? More like a partnership. You know the land, the people, the real challenges they face. I know how to fight in the corporate arena." For the first time since Jonathan had arrived, Thomas looked truly excited. "You know, your mother always said you'd find your way eventually. Said you had her heart and my stubbornness. Perfect combination for doing good in the world." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret's car. She hurried up to the porch, waving a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked, handing it to Jonathan. "It just came out." The headline read, "Corporate CEO turns environmental champion. Jonathan Reed takes stand against water exploitation." Jonathan skimmed the article, which painted him as a corporate insider who had seen the light and used his knowledge to help a small town fight back against exploitation. The piece ended with speculation about what this might mean for his future at Reed Enterprises. "They're making you out to be some kind of hero," Margaret said, beaming. "The whole town is talking about it." Jonathan handed the paper to his father. "I'm no hero, I just finally did the right thing." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Thomas replied, reading the article with interest. That evening, as Jonathan prepared dinner, he had become surprisingly comfortable in his mother's kitchen. His phone rang again. It was Jessica. "I saw the news," she said without preamble. "It's everywhere. Corporate raider turns eco-warrior." "What are you doing, Jonathan?" "Finding my purpose," he replied simply. Jessica sighed. "The board is split. Half think you've lost your mind. The other half think it's brilliant PR. And what do you think?" There was a long pause. "I think you're not coming back. Not the way you were before." "No," Jonathan admitted. "I'm not. I can't follow you on this journey, Jonathan. This rural crusader thing. It's not me, it's not the life we planned." Jonathan felt a twinge of sadness, but no regret. "I know, and I understand." After they said goodbye, Jonathan knew it was truly over. Jessica belonged to his old life, a life that no longer fit the person he was becoming. 2 days later, Jonathan received an email that made his heart race. It was from a community in Colorado facing a similar situation, a large corporation trying to buy up land for mineral rights. They had read about his stand against Midwest development and were asking for his help. He showed the email to his father. "Hey, it's already happening. People are reaching out." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like you've found your calling." The next morning, Thomas's doctor gave him a clean bill of health. "Your recovery has been remarkable, Mr. Reed. Just keep taking your medication and check in with me monthly." As they drove home from the appointment, Thomas looked at his son. "You don't need to stay anymore. I'm fine now." "I know," Jonathan replied. "But I want to stay, at least part of the time." "What about your company?" Jonathan smiled. "I had a long video call with the board last night. I laid out my vision for a new division of Reed Enterprises, one focused on helping rural communities protect their resources against corporate exploitation." "And they agreed?" Thomas asked, surprised. "Not all of them. 3 board members resigned in protest, but the majority saw the potential, both for doing good and for rehabilitating our image. Reed Enterprises has been seen as a predator for too long. This is a chance to change that perception." Thomas shook his head in amazement. "Never thought I'd see the day when you'd use your corporate powers for good." "Me neither," Jonathan admitted. "But it feels right." They pulled up to the farm and Jonathan saw an unfamiliar truck parked in the driveway. A middle-aged couple stood on the porch talking with Margaret. "Who's that?" Jonathan asked. Thomas squinted. "Looks like the Hendersons from the next county. Their community has been fighting a mining company for years." Jonathan felt a surge of energy. "Sounds like we might have our second client." Over the next month, Jonathan split his time between Chicago and the farm. In the city, he restructured Reed Enterprises, creating a new division called Reed Community Advocacy. He handpicked a team of lawyers, PR specialists, and financial experts dedicated to helping rural communities fight corporate exploitation. In Millersville, he and Thomas converted the old barn into an office space. Local farmers started stopping by with questions, concerns, and sometimes just to chat with the Reeds. Father and son now working side by side. News of their work spread. More communities reached out for help. Jonathan found himself traveling to small towns across the country, teaching them how to use corporate tactics against the very corporations threatening their ways of life. One evening in late autumn, Jonathan sat on the porch with his father, watching. The sun set over the fields. The farm looked different now, not because it had changed, but because Jonathan had. What once seemed like a burden, a remnant of a past he wanted to escape, now felt like a foundation, a place of strength and purpose. "Dad," Jonathan said suddenly. "Thank you." Thomas looked surprised. "For what?" "For not selling, for being stubborn, for making me come back and remember what matters." Thomas smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "You know, when you first showed, up in that fancy car looking at this place like it was dirt on your shoe, I almost gave up on you. I'm glad you didn't." "Your mother never would have forgiven me," Thomas said, his voice soft with memory. "She always said you'd find your way back, one way or another." Jonathan looked out at the land that had raised him, that had shaped his father, and now was reshaping him. "I think I finally understand what you meant that first day, about real power being knowing where you came from and respecting it." Thomas nodded. "Some lessons money can't buy." A car pulled up in the driveway. Frank Miller, returning from a meeting with farmers in a neighboring county where another development company was causing trouble. "Your next appointment is here," Thomas said with a grin. "Ready to save another small town, Mr. Corporate Crusader?" Jonathan laughed, standing up. "Only if you're with me, Dad." As they walked together toward Frank's truck, Jonathan realized something profound. He had left this farm 15 years ago, convinced that success meant escaping his roots, building something entirely new. Now he understood that true success meant building on those roots, honoring them, and using them to create something meaningful. He had come home not to rescue his father, but to be rescued by him, to be reminded of who he truly was and who he could become. The lesson money couldn't buy was the simplest one of all. Real wealth wasn't measured in dollars or deals, but in purpose, in principles, and in the people who loved you enough to tell you the truth. As the sun set over the Reed farm, father and son walked side by side, no longer divided by their differences, but united by their shared values. Values that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. Like the land itself, they had endured, weathered, and ultimately flourished. And in that moment, Jonathan Reed, once the arrogant millionaire who had sneered at his father's simple life, finally understood that he was the son of the richest man he had ever known. The end.